Ah. Why do we do this to ourselves? No, really, why? Why do we make things so hard for ourselves when we can have anything we want at the push of a button? These are deleter screen tones, and it's what manga artists use to add gray tones to their drawings. I've always wanted to try these out, but just buying them online, they've just been, it wasn't really sensible to buy them because of how expensive they were. So the next most sensible thing to do, of course, is to fly to Japan, hunt these down, and buy them back. So the way these work is that it is a transparent sheet with dots printed on it. And the closer these dots are together, the more dense it is, the darker the perceived value of it is. Now, because manga was historically printed in cheap newsprint with pure black ink, well, this is a, back in the day, relatively easy and consistent way of adding gray tones to your drawings. Now, of course, you could hatch and shade it normally with a pen, but that was just way too slow and inconsistent compared to these sheets. And the look of this screen print is what I would primarily associate with the manga style. And I know that Western comics also do halftone printing, but because it is black and white and it's just maybe what I grew up with, this is what I primarily think of when I think of the manga style. So I'm going to try drawing a page of manga with this, and I'm going to follow the whole traditional process, the way that we do it back in the day. Besides that, I also have this nib set that I bought from Sekaido. I see a bunch of nibs here that are commonly used in manga drawing. So there is a Maru nib in here, a G nib, and also a spoon nib. But it's just a set of nibs, like a kit for I guess all your comic drawing needs. So of course the manga page I'm doing is going to be mech related. And last night I did a bunch of thumbnail sketches for the layout of the page on post-it notes. It's just an easy way for me to figure out what the page layout is going to look like and the design and all that before jumping into a full-size page. So why do it this way? For the longest time I thought it was because of the IKEA effect. The IKEA effect basically means that because you put effort into building something yourself, you assign more value to it. I just assume that applied to making art as well, but I don't think that's the case because, I've spent hours, days, weeks even on a piece and it would turn out to be absolute garbage, but it didn't matter. I'd still have a good time. I didn't assign much value to the end product to begin with. What's up with that? Before I start, can I just say this is very intimidating. I think I'm just gonna start all the way at the bottom here, which is the thing that I'm most comfortable with. And then once I'm warmed up for that, I will just move on to everything else. Before I started inking this page, I actually did a quick test with all the 5 nibs that were in the nib set that I bought. There's a uncut full video of me testing these nibs out on Patreon, but essentially these fall into 3 categories of nibs. There's the mapping pen, there are 2 variations of what I would call a G nib, and then 2 sort of spoon nibs. So these nibs are just broadly speaking what most artists would use when it comes to drawing manga. It's just the most commonly used ones. And I initially had planned to just use 1 or 2 out of the 5, whichever 2 I guess felt better to me. But then I just sort of, after thinking about it a little bit, decided to use 1 nib for each panel. And so that way you basically get to see a more visual difference between what these pens can do, and if there are even any visual differences. If you're a fan of sports, you hear this saying thrown around a lot. If you do everything right, if you give every little step your best effort, you eventually, inevitably achieve success. That's trusting the process. On some level, I agree with that sentiment. In a perfect world, yeah, sure. But this isn't a perfect world, and there are so many methods of circumnavigating, of bypassing the process. why bother? The implication with trusting the process is that you're trusting it to do something. There's an expectation of a result. To do what? I assume to become a better artist, to make better art, but is that really the end goal? What does winning at art look like? And is that going to make me happy? The ink I used was basic Sumi ink that I bought at Daiso for like $2 for a large bottle. These pens are designed for use with these inks, so there was no real issue with that pairing. I did, however, run into a little bit of issues with the ink flowing at the beginning of using a nib, but that was because I didn't give it a proper clean. So after washing the nib with a little bit of dish soap and just warm water, I basically solved that issue because there was a coating of sort of oil on the nib to protect it from rusting. And so you have to kind of wash that off before you even start using a nib. I also got really lucky with the nib holder that I'm using, which accepts 2 different sizes of nibs, because the mapping pen, which you can see is a very thin pen, it doesn't really fit into most of the other nib holders, because most nib holders only have a hole for one size of nibs. So that's just something to keep in mind. Everything else fits into the larger size, but then this mapping pen in particular is a little bit thinner, and you're gonna have to get a nib holder that has that size, or one that accepts 2 different sizes like the one that I'm using in the video. But back to the inking process. With these nibs, each different nib has its own personality and characteristics, which becomes very apparent when you're using it because they just feel so different, and as a result you sort of produce a different art style according to the nib that you're using. So the tools do matter. With the mapping pen that I'm using right now, there's a reason it's used for shoujo manga, because it's very flexible and there's a lot of line width variability to the nib, and you just get these really nice organic lines that just, you know, vary in width as you go. So that's probably one of the reasons why people use it for shoujo manga, because, you know, when drawing you know, the female form or things like clothing and hair, it's really nice to have that very soft organic look. Okay, now that the inking is done, let me just show you which deleter screen tones I bought, and let's go through some of these and how I'm going to use them. Here are all of the sheets that I bought. So the first one that we're going to look at is just these flat screen tones. So these are all the same value, and they're just little dots printed onto the sheet, and there's like a paper backing, so it is adhesive. And what you're supposed to do is just peel this piece of paper off and stick it onto your page. And there's a little bit of info here about these dots. So I guess this is like the version number. I don't know what this is. Maybe it's a size 27.5 and then 30, which is probably opacity or value. So it's like 30% gray or something like that. So here you see this is like a 40% black or 40% gray, which is a little bit darker than the 30% gray that I have here. And then these I have here, this one is just more shading, but it's just texture. So it's like hashing, but you know, I don't have to manually do any of it. So this is something that's a little bit different, a little bit more special than just the dots. And so these are my gradient sheets, and this one is from 5% gray to 90% gray. So that's the gradient. And then this one goes from 0 to 100 right here. So here you can see it's almost like opaque and black, pure black. Whereas up here you can see my finger through the sheet. It's like 0, which means it's basically completely transparent. So the first thing I'm going to start with is this one here at the bottom, which is the easiest one to do, I think. And also I think it's the most straightforward one. So I'm going to start with that, and the tools I have with me are really simple. It's just a box cutter and I think a scissors, but the scissors is mainly just to use the back, just to like rub all the screen tone in. I'm going to try it out. My table is wobbling so much. This has to be a bad thing, so let's do it. All right. Suffice to say that this is an incredibly nerve-wracking experience for me, just because I really didn't know the amount of pressure I should be putting on the screen tone with my knife. I was so afraid of cutting through that and, you know, cutting into my actual drawing. which kind of did happen. I left little small marks on the paper underneath, and I also cut through the screen tone sheet itself. Great, okay. So I'm gonna use this to yeah. I'm actually, can you see this? I'm actually sweating. Okay, so now I just have to cut it really lightly just to get remove. Stay on. How did people do this? How did they do this back in the day? You guys are crazy. Oh. I just take a picture. I just need coffee. I just need coffee. So now that I have this mask, what I've seen some people do is that they'll use the back of their penknife to like scrape off some bits of this to get, I guess, some sort of highlight or rim light around the edges and maybe like specular highlight, spots of light in armor or the eyes and stuff like that. Okay, I'm just gonna start scraping. We'll see how this goes. I want a highlight sort of here and maybe a little bit of light over here. Going through this whole process, I kept thinking about people who were, artisans who do stuff the old way. Like a blacksmith who forges knives in a coal furnace, because surely you can get better knives that are made in a factory, more durable, sharper, more precise, etc. But when it's artisanal, there's sort of an inherent value to that compared to something that was spit out of a machine. It's kind of like film photography where, why do people still shoot with film cameras? And I don't think it's because of image quality. Because if I did a blind test of a picture that was shot on a digital camera, edited to look like, a film photo versus a picture that was actually shot on 35mm celluloid, 90% of people would not be able to pick out one from the other. There's just something else there, and I think film photographers kind of understand it to a degree too, whether they want to admit it or not, that there's something really appealing and lovely about buying the film, loading it into the camera, winding it up, pressing the shutter button, and then not seeing the photo until a couple of weeks later after it's developed. There's something there that makes them want to do it, despite it being a objectively more inefficient way of taking photos. So the next one I'm gonna do is probably the background for this these two panels. So I'm gonna use this sketchy crosshatch. So this is the part of the process for me where it's the most fun, where I'm more comfortable with cutting out these screen tones, so the whole process is just less anxious and I'm just being more comfortable and having more fun in the moment. It's also really satisfying when you get the mask just right and you cut it just nice, because when you're peeling it off, it feels like peeling that screen protected, a little bit of plastic off of a brand new phone. It's so nice. Okay, so for the last panel, I want to use these gradient sheets for the body of the Mac. So I think that even though this size fits really perfectly over the Mac, I think it might be too much. I think 0 to 100 across this little bit here might be too aggressive. So I think I'm gonna use a softer gradient. So something like this, where it goes from 5% to halfway to 90%. So something like 50 or 45%. Great. And then, so that's a little bit more subtle and softer as opposed to the 0 to 100, which is really, really aggressive. So I think I'm just gonna cut out this bit here for the mech, which is, it feels like a waste because I'm not using the entire gradient, but it's just the one that feels the most right at the moment. The gradient screen tone in particular, I found to be quite tricky to cut because it has to be, for the gradient to remain continuous, be a single sheet of screen tone. So that means there can't be any breaks in the whole form. So I basically had to cut it out all in one go, which I found to be difficult and nerve-wracking. Having said that, I found the whole process to be rather forgiving and not as intimidating as I initially thought. Even if you make wrong cut, or if you cut into a screen tone by accident, it's really hard to spot the mistake because it gets obscured within all of the dots. And because the adhesive is very low tack, you can actually just peel it off and reapply it, and peel it off and reapply it as many times as you need until you get the right placement. What happens if after all this process and the trusting of it, you end up with nothing? What happens if you do your drills and your workouts every day and end up at the bottom of the table at the end of the season? I want to propose a slight adjustment to this philosophy, and that is to love the process. To love something, at least to me, is to demand nothing of it, to have no expectations of it, to love it for what it is. I like making thumbnails, doing my little pencil sketches, and drawing with a dip pen. I just like doing it this way. It doesn't have to yield results. It doesn't have to point towards a greater goal. I just like making things this way. There's no denying that there's a pleasure in making a successful piece of art, whatever your definition of success may be. But there's also a pleasure in detaching yourself from the outcome. After all, who cares if it's good or bad? To trust the process is to demand consistency from an inconsistent universe. To love the process is to give something of yourself to the universe. To fall in love with every little step, every little line, outcome be damned. First of all, a huge amount of respect to the people who used to do it this way back before digital art was a thing. I mean, they were doing this for page after page after page for weeks and months and years, and that's just something that I could never comprehend doing myself. Second of all is whether traditional screen tones done this way are still a viable way of shading your manga art. I think that there is a slight difference between a digital and a traditional version of a screen tone. I think when it comes to digital screen tones, it's just too perfect. The black dots are perfectly filled, and you don't get the artifacts that you see on a printed screen tone, because if you look really closely, there's a little bit of artifacting and just some blurring around the edges and imperfections in the dots that you just would not get digitally. But whether it's viable, I think, is up to a matter of your circumstances, whether you have the time and money for it, and also maybe personal preference. But as for me, I like making things this way, and I think I'm gonna keep doing it. Thank you for watching, and have a good day. Oh! What do I do? Oh no! Oh, I almost dipped it in my coffee. It just makes me really uneasy because I feel like I might just snap. Oh no! No, this again.